I'm Gary Simmons, fine artist from New York, now based in LA. This is my LA studio here in Alhambra. I grew up in New York primarily to be an athlete. There were two things I was really interested in pursuing was baseball and my art. At a certain point, injuries prevented me from going on to the next level. You know, I was very fortunate that whether it was sports or it was the art, my family was very, very supportive and encouraging. When I was really little, I would go behind the sofa and draw on the wall. I remember my mother saying, "Oh my God, he's drawing all over the wall." I immediately thought I was in trouble, and my father just let him do his thing. We can always paint over it. You have to remember my parents are from the West Indies, so I'm first generation. So the idea of being from the West Indies and being an artist was unheard of. As a young artist, there's certain things that happen along the way. It's not just you. There are instructors and people along the way that help you get to where you are. And you have to at least acknowledge that those people were there. And so, you know, when I was in school, Jack Whitten was one of the foundation mentors that I had. I got to School of Visual Arts. I remember Jack coming into my studio at Visual Arts and saying, I think that the conceptual dialogue that you're interested in is based in California, and you need to go out there and you need to meet John Baldessari, you need to meet Michael Asher, you need to meet you know, all of these folks that are out there. And it started to click for me. The first time that I knew I wanted to be an artist was, I'll never forget it, I know it like it happened this morning. I was pretty young. I think it was around like Thanksgiving time, and The Wizard of Oz came on. And I'd never seen The Wizard of Oz before. You know, there's this whole early part of it where it's all in black and white, and then there's like this kind of scary part where the witch is on the bicycle outside the window and all this stuff, and the house lands. And I was sitting on the floor with my hands, you know, like this, watching the movie, and there's that moment. She opens the door, and suddenly it's Oz, and it goes from black and white to Technicolor. And I remember looking up at my mother and I was saying, I want to do that. And she was like, you can do that, you can do anything. I am always going to be chasing that moment of beauty where the door opens and you're just like, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my whole life. And it's stayed with me ever since. And I think that there's strength and power in creating a beautiful object. Even if something is very charged politically, you know, I've done gardens where they're incredibly saturated color, beautiful images, but then you start looking at what the image is, and it's this, you know, image of hate. I'm just talking about the Garden of Hate I did, which is the badge of the Klan embedded in this beautiful floral garden of begonias. And most people don't recognize it until they stand back from it, and then it's like this chilling moment, again, where it's physical sensation of your reaction to something visual. And I think that there's nothing more powerful than that. The wall drawings really changed the trajectory of my career for a number of reasons. I think that it's an attempt to erase a stereotype. And these are all the blurred lines and the abstraction that happens when you attempt to obliterate or erase an image, you know, and there's bits and pieces and fragments that are left behind, and it forces the viewer to fill in those gaps because they're drawn directly on the institution. So whether it's the museum or the gallery or the collector's house, you're including them into the dialogue of critical discourse. And when those exhibitions come down, those drawings become essentially part of the history of that place that they occupied. It occupies a place in your memory as to what you experienced, which is altered. So I think that it has this layering that goes on in the wall drawings that permeates throughout all of the work that I do. Screaming Into the Ether being the last show that I did at Metro Pictures. It wasn't a planned thing. I think that I was interested in revisiting some of the earlier images that I was working with. When you get to be an artist my age, you're able to come back around and reference yourself, and it has a completely new context because there's this history that you've created along the way. A lot of the images have taken on a lot of the issues and information along the way that were constructed underneath a lot of that work. I think that some of the cartoon-based work was specifically a race discussion, and over the years it took on a lot of architectural issues came into play, and space and places that you occupy as bodies. And that wasn't just anchored to a racial experience, but it sort of allowed an entrance ramp for other people to enter the work in a certain way. I realized along the way early on that there needed to be access points in multiple places for people to access my work, that it's not, you know, my experience, it's our experience. And I think that the cartoons play a strong part of that. The fact that they're now on canvas and made with paint, so there's a permanence to them, even though they still have this kind of blurred erasure, temporal aspect to them. They play and they hover between those things. So that way that an image hovers between representation and abstraction will always be a part of the work. Screaming Into the Ether as a title, and even that painting, it's interesting because it was so poignant for the times that we're in right now, politically and otherwise, and even the pandemic. You know, the show was put together obviously before the pandemic, and then suddenly we all, like, life just ground to a halt. And for the first part of that show, it was, you know, in like this frozen room. It literally was like screaming into the ether. Can you hear me? You're screaming maybe for help, or you're screaming out of frustration or out of anger or rage or whatever, but it's going into this abyss. And I think that everybody at that time, post-election, immersed in pandemic, that sense of not having ground underneath you was a real sense of literally screaming into ether. Although I'm very attached to that show, once it went out into the world, for you to experience it, that's your experience that I'm trying to construct. And I think that that's what you're after, is creating those kinds of moments for folks to access something that you created or you did, that they can take those moments and have their own private experience with it that's in a public sort of sphere. And if it goes a little bit beyond that, then so be it. But I think that you're really just constructing moments. And you have to be kind of attached to the idea of doing that. I think art is a vehicle to create a moment of question and thought, and that's the driving mode while you do this. I wish there was some way that we could actually make the experience of entering an art gallery, which is still free, more inclusive, that people feel much more comfortable going into. You know, to this day, even my mother has trouble entering art galleries. She still feels intimidated by walking in the door. I don't know how you break that, but I do know that when you look around an opening, it's not that inclusive. We want to pat ourselves on the back and we want to say, well, it's for everybody and access to it is this and that and the other, but you really are still talking to a certain group of people that are like-minded for the most part. And that's unfortunate. I think we can do a lot more to expand that. Because I think that there's a lot of things that are being said that more people can have an affinity towards or an identity with. You can't predict how somebody is going to respond to an image that you make. You can just put out what you were thinking at the time, and then it goes into the ether.